Todd, take it away.
Thank you, Rosemary. And all of you should be ashamed of yourselves for being here tonight when it's so beautiful out there. I mean, it's the first. What? Recess. We'll call it early. Go outside. I mean, what a beautiful evening. It's March 30th. It's the second to last day of Women's History Month, so I thought I would do a women's history and focusing especially on women in World War II. And I was thinking, driving here, you've probably heard the phrase about, Lou, I have such a hard time even looking at you with that mask on. Oh my God. I was thinking, driving over here, that you sometimes hear that this past year has been like one big social experiment, mainly of what it's like to work from home, what it's like, to shop online, to have restaurants closed, that kind of thing. Like we're learning lessons. One business owner I know sold his building, and all his 45 employees are going to work from home from now on. And it's like in the past year, the rules of ordinary life have been suspended or rearranged, and it is somewhat reminiscent of what life was like in World War II, when the kind of ordinary ways of working and living were suspended for the duration of the war. Now in World War II, it covered way more things. I mean, what you could buy, how much you could drive, what kind of job that you had. It involved a whole lot more, and it lasted much longer. But one of the things that it involved was a radically new role for women in society. The old roles had been suspended, and women came into the workforce. And that's one of the main things I'm really going to talk about tonight. I thought I'd start with an eccentric story about an eccentric couple that you might have heard of. You might have, if you have Netflix, you might have seen it. There was a recent movie, not a big movie, but thank goodness there was a movie made of them, because they are really fascinating people. But before the movie that came out on Netflix, I think last year or the year before, nobody really knew about William Marston and Elizabeth Marston. They were an unusual couple, to be sure. They were, I guess, what you would call a liberated couple or an emancipated couple. She was something, in 1905, 1910, that very few people were. She was a feminist. And according to her parents, she was a feminist from a young age. She always wanted to go to college. And she did. She wanted to go to Harvard, but Harvard didn't accept women. She ended up going somewhere else, and then she wanted to get a law degree, and she wanted to do that at Harvard. Harvard didn't accept women, so she went to Boston University, graduated first in her class with a law degree. There's a neat little story about her taking the bar exam, and she was the first one to finish, Elizabeth was, the bar exam. And she really enjoyed, putting down her pencil or pen, walking outside and sitting on the curb and waiting for all the men to come out of the bar exam, to see that she's the first one done. Kind of a show off, but that's okay. And then immediately after she, became a lawyer, she decided she didn't like it, and actually what she really wanted to do was to be a psychologist. So she wanted to get a PhD in psychology. Where else? At Harvard, but they didn't accept women. So she ended up going to Radcliffe, but they didn't have a PhD program, so she did a master's. And it was there that she met her husband, William. William Marston had followed the same route. He'd been a lawyer, and he was now getting his PhD in psychology at Harvard. And the two of them had a relationship, and they were also these, researchers together. They were this creative couple. They worked together at Harvard on creating the first prototype of a lie detector. They had a theory that, if you're not telling the truth, there are physiological changes, body temperature, other things. Paul said you could tell, once you get a baseline, you could tell if somebody's being truthful or not. So they created the first kind of prototype of a lie detector. And to say that William was enchanted with Elizabeth is an understatement. He was absolutely more than smitten with her. He worshipped her, and he began to adopt her point of view of the world, which is, okay, I'm a little safer to say this in here, Her point of view was that men were really not worth much. And that women were better at everything. Everything. They were a really creative couple. They invented something that maybe many of you have taken, the DISC personality inventory. One of the first modern personality inventories. They created it, William and Elizabeth Marston. They wrote this book, Emotions of Normal People. They wrote other books. They gave speeches around the world, not just around the nation. They consulted with Hollywood as Hollywood was making the transition from silent movies to talkies. They consulted with the government. They were really high-level consultants and experts that a lot of people consulted with. And again, you know, William's point of view was that he realized that women were better at everything. They were more cooperative, they were smarter, they were more patient, they followed directions, they were more creative. You know, you name it, they did it better. But he actually believed that at some point, men would essentially disappear and the world would be, I know, ridiculous. The world would be run by women. But he was pessimistic about how that would come about because in the 1930s, he saw something happening around the world that just confirmed his low opinion of men. And that was what we might call a kind of a toxic masculinity that was expressing itself as fascism around the world. He interpreted Hitler, Mussolini, Japanese militarism as a kind of, you know, hyper-aggressive masculinity gone wild. And he saw, you know, the United States is not immune. That the US is also in the grip of this hyper-masculine culture, popular culture, especially where there's so much violence everywhere. And he especially was alarmed in 1939, 1940 by the appearance, and it is odd, that within a span of truly 12 months, every major superhero comic came out. But 1939, 1940. So, most of these are still with us today, right? Batman, you see in the upper middle, the Flash, the Green Lantern on the lower left, Captain Marvel on the lower right, the Human Torch on the upper right, Superman. They all came out. All these, you know, superheroes with these, you know, great powers came out all around the same time at the beginning of World War II. And Marston thought this was horrible and a really, you know, encouraging violence in American society. And he did a really widely read article for interview with Family Circle magazine. The title was "Don't Laugh at the Comics," and it was about the degeneration of American popular culture and how, you know, we're in trouble. We're headed towards a global catastrophe with hyper-masculinity run amok. And so the president of DC Comics, a guy named Max Gaines, did something really smart for a man. They were getting, you know, comic book publishers were getting a lot of criticism. And instead of fighting back, he invited William and Elizabeth to lunch, and they had a series of conversations. What is it going to take, William, to get you to shut up about the comic industry? And he had one demand, and that is, I want a female superhero, which is the most ridiculous thing you could ever imagine. Because not only was it a female superhero, but a female superhero who could not use violence or aggression to, you know, advocate for their causes. They had to solve all problems with love, truth, and compassion. Could you imagine that? That sounds like the most boring comic book I ever want to read. And Max Gaines had the insight to make a deal with the Marstons that they would stop criticizing the comic industry if he created a female superhero. And this was the first iteration of what the illustrator came up with when he met with Elizabeth. She was patterned after Elizabeth, and she, of course, became Wonder Woman. And I wish you could read, maybe afterward you could come up and read these notes that William Marston is writing, because he's commenting on, he essentially says he wants her to look a little sexier, and that she's wearing shoes that make her look like a stenographer. Some of you are old enough to know what a stenographer was. And that was the first iteration of what would become Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was a comic book. The first one was released in the first week of December 1941. And I don't know if any of you are Wonder Woman aficionados, but the backstory to Wonder Woman is she is a race of women, Amazon women they're called, who live on a secluded island in the Pacific called Paradise Island. And you know it's a utopia. You know it's paradise, right? Because
there's no men.
No men, exactly. Yes, they live in paradise in an island with no men. Until one day, a OSS pilot, an Office of Strategic Services pilot, which was the forerunner of the CIA, named Steve Trevor. He's an officer, he's a pilot, he crash lands on Paradise Island. And they tend to, he's hurt, but they revive him. And he brings news to Paradise Island that they were ignorant of because they were living in utopia. He tells the women that the earth has been taken over by fascists and that they need your superpowers to come and rid the world of fascism. So the women debate whether or not they should help out or to stay, in utopia, and they elect that they will choose one woman, one of them, and it happened to be Diana Prince, I think was her name. They chose Diana Prince to go back with Steve Trevor to the world and rid the earth of fascism. And this is the first, right here, a page from the first issue of Wonder Woman. So she goes back with Steve Trevor, and sure enough, she does not use weapons. She does not kill anybody. The only thing that she has, I believe she only has 2 powers, I believe.
The cords.
The what?
The cords around the wrist.
Yeah, the bracelets, right? Around her wrists that deflect bullets.
Right.
And then she has the lasso of truth, a lie detector, where when she lassos you, you have to tell the truth. And it's with those, with that equipment, she goes back to the world, and she starts fighting fascism with Steve Trevor. And of course, as you can imagine, Steve Trevor loves Wonder Woman. I mean, he is head over heels in love with Wonder Woman, and that's like a whole story through many issues. He's always proposing marriage to her, and she's always refusing.
It's not crazy.
Did you say that's not crazy?
I said she's not crazy.
Yeah, she's not crazy. He says, Angel, when are we going to be married? And she says, when evil and injustice vanish from the earth. In other words, you're going to be waiting a while. And then he says, you are superb, if only you would marry me. And she says, if I married you, Steve, I'd have to pretend I'm weaker than you are to make you happy. And that no woman should do. This is a weird comic book. For 1941? For 1941, there was nothing like that out there in the popular culture. This was it. This was by far the most feminist thing that was out there in American popular culture. By far. There was nothing quite like it. It was very strange. No other comic book was like it, and one other very strange thing about it that readers absolutely noticed was that Diana Prince, Wonder Woman, gets tied up a lot. And she likes it. Every single issue, she's getting tied up. She does it kind of like for fun. Always is tied up. There's a whole lot about that. Look at these images here.
That's funny.
Readers began writing to Max Gain saying, we like the comics, but what's up with the ropes and chains? And in fact, part of the backstory of Wonder Woman, and part of the backstory of William and Elizabeth, is yes, they were into that big time. They were bondage fetishists. And in the comic book Wonder Woman, back in Paradise Island, that's what they do for fun. They tie each other up. And this is really a big part of the story of Wonder Woman. And Max Gaines gets a little concerned. And he writes this wonderful letter, and he says, I told you in our conference last week to cut down the use of chains by at least 50 to 75% without at all interfering with the excitement of the story or the sales of the books. And so this is all to say that, you know, they were strange. They were a strange couple. This was a strange comic book. And the one final strange thing about Elizabeth and William is that it wasn't just Elizabeth and William. William was married to two women at the same time. And the two women were also married to each other. So it was William, Elizabeth, and Olive. Olive was the journalist who wrote that Family Circle article. They had a family together, the three of them, two different sets of children. And when William died shortly after World War II, suddenly Olive and Elizabeth lived the rest of their lives as a couple together. Now this is all to say that for 1940, 1941, this is a very strange couple, right? This is a very strange piece of culture. And the point of me going into this whole story is that how culture works is that any other year, this Wonder Woman would have been an oddity of American culture. It would have been a footnote that people would dig up and rediscover maybe, but it would have not have lasted very long. Who would ever get it or understand it in 1941? But Wonder Woman came out the very week of the attacks at Pearl Harbor. And how culture works is, you have these artists who are weird. And I know that because my brother is one. And they're idiosyncratic. They march to the beat of their own drummer. And most of the time they're creating works that other people don't relate to or don't understand or don't get. And they're forgotten. But every once in a while, the creative idiosyncrasies of the artists intersect with the needs of the culture. And that's when something in our language goes viral. That is when you have a hit and a mega hit, like Wonder Woman. And that's exactly what happened with Wonder Woman. When it came out, the attacks of Pearl Harbor immediately changed everything very suddenly. The federal government knew, even before the attacks, that if we were to fight a two-front global war, we were going to need masses of women who were not currently in the workforce to join the workforce. We were going to need 10 million to replace all the men who were going to go into the military. That was the initial estimate. Plus, we are going to need 15 million additional women, 25 million women altogether, who are not currently in the workforce, doing jobs they've never done before, because they're going to have a full employment, full capacity economy, building munitions and preparing for war and fighting the war. And every adult was essentially going to have to be part of the labor market and the war effort. And so, kind of the needs of the war and Wonder Woman just converged right together. And that's why Wonder Woman is with us still. She came at just the right time. Just the right time. Because of this kind of labor need. It was not an easy thing. I think we take it for granted today that there's a need for labor, women join the workforce, and join the war effort. We take it for granted that that happened, but it was not easy. The federal government had to convince women to go to work, and especially had to convince their husbands to let them. Women and Americans had been lectured for well over a decade that women should get out of the workforce. Look at these statistics, 77% in the Great Depression, 77% of all school districts barred married women from teaching. Some of you might be old enough to remember being in school, having a teacher who then got married and she was gone. Or maybe she got married and didn't tell anybody and kept her job. This was a very common thing nationwide. 26 states passed laws against women working, married women working. 82% of Americans believe that married women should not work outside the home. That's Gallup, 1936. So there was a big prejudice, a big bias against women joining the workforce, and a huge part of the Office of War Information and the War Production Board, a huge part of their, you could call it propaganda or you could call it a publicity campaign, was to convince the women and their husbands that their wives should take a war job. You have wonderful things like this, like a little pamphlet that the women would pick up that would coach them. Here's how you convince your husband that it's okay to take a war job. I love this cartoon. This is from the Des Moines Register, 1943. There was a fear that if women went off to work, they would never come back home. And I think this cartoon expresses it beautifully. Here's a giant woman with the overalls. She has a hammer. She has a big lunch pail. In her rear pocket, she has a man-sized pay envelope. And she's headed off to work. Her little dinky husband down here. Yeah, he's really hard to see down here. He's yelling at her. But remember, you've got to come right back as soon as the war is over. And she says, oh yeah? That was it. That was the fear. That once you give women that power, what's going to happen? So this was a heavy lift. And in fact, a consortium of advertising agencies got together and they created something called the War Advertising Council, where for free, they joined together to promote advertising in support of women entering the workforce. The War Advertising Council. The War Advertising Council is still with us today. It's now called the Ad Council. And if you listen to the radio, if you watch TV, you will see an Ad Council, what's the word? Public service announcement, advertising, about drugs or, getting a vaccine or whatever it is, promoting kind of social good. That started with World War II, with the War Advertising Council. And their first campaign was perhaps their most successful. And I have a cousin who's in marketing, a marketing professor, and he would argue that it might have been the most successful advertising campaign of all time. A campaign that began in 1942 to convince women and their families that it's okay for women to enter the workforce. It was a full court press, an all-out blitz, all hands on deck to get the word out that women needed, that this was critical to the war effort to get women in factories and shops and offices, in the fields even, and in jobs that they hadn't been in before. As a token of success, the women working appeared in every major American magazine on the cover in 1943. This is when everybody read the glossy, popular magazines. Every single popular nationwide magazine had, at some point in 1943, a working woman on the cover and advertising an article about women working. And the argument was pretty simple. It was, number one, that a woman can do any job a man can do. Like you see in this poster. Good work, sister. We never figured you could do a man-sized job. America's women have met the test. That was the idea. But employers were learning something more. It turns out that in 1942, the government was very much on this. They wanted to get reports back from personnel managers, human resource managers, about how these new women coming into their shops are doing. And what do you think the personnel managers said?
Better.
The what?
Better than men.
They're better than men. Every single one. Yeah. I mean, it is truly remarkable across industries, in just about every occupation. The vast majority of personnel managers are saying, I would love to employ all women. They don't show up at work drunk. They don't get in fights on the shop floor. They are willing to take instructions from their superiors. They are safer. They're more careful. They're more detail-oriented. They have better memories, better dexterity. They solve problems better. I see you giggling. You're not allowed to giggle about this. It's not funny. You see this, women are patient, women are cooperative, women are careful. It was absolutely true. And I mean, in the Army, if we have time, I'll talk about it later, but the Army did an experiment and found the same thing, that women were better soldiers than men. They were more careful. You know, they solved problems together. Yeah, the same thing just translated into the military. It's remarkable how women just flooded in to new industries. Before World War II, 1% of all employees in the aircraft industry were women, 1%. During the war, 65% were. Some industries attracted huge numbers, like there's a lathe operator, a machinist working in the consolidated aircraft industry. 15% of all steelworkers were women during World War II. After the war, they would be kicked out of the industry and they wouldn't come back until the 1970s. 25% of all shipyard workers working on all the ships that had to be built to fight the war were women, like Wendy Welder here at the Richmond shipyards in Richmond, California. The icon of all these women doing all these jobs that had, previously been the province of men was Rosie the Riveter. And you all have heard of Rosie the Riveter, but did you know, because I didn't until I started teaching this stuff, I didn't know that it was originally a song. That's where Rosie the Riveter came from. It was a song first, but a hit by the Four Vagabonds. Not even 2 minutes long. Do you want me to play it?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm doing something really mean to you by playing this. Because I'll tell you, once you hear it, you're going to go to bed tonight with it in your head. I forgot to bring in my speakers, but let's see how loud it is.
All day long when the rain does shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the Riveter, keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage. Sitting up there on this line, that little Riveter do more than the Riveter. Rosie, the Riveter, Rosie and her friend Charlie, he's the Marine. Rosie is protecting Charlie, working overtime on the riveting machine. When they gave her a production lead, she was as proud as a girl could be. There was something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie, the Riveter.
Okay, you get the point. It's a wonderful song, very catchy, very, very catchy. And it became a hit, and it was redone by other people, 2 minutes long, Rosie the Riveter, and it stuck. It kind of stuck in our, in our craniums. And it's what inspired, the song inspired Norman Rockwell to do this famous cover of the Saturday Evening Post on May 29, 1943. The model for it was his neighbor, a 19-year-old neighbor, Mary Doyle, who wasn't a riveter. I can't remember what her job was, maybe a telephone operator, something like that. She posed, he had her pose in the pose of the prophet Isaiah, who had been painted on the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo in 1509. So you can see how she mimics Isaiah's, stance. She has a riveting gun right here. She has a lunch-tail Rosie. At her feet are on line pump. And she's got these big muscles. She's got a kind of a commanding presence, and she's eating a sandwich, just like a man would do on a break. It's a wonderful image. You don't see it very often. I always like to say, because the Rockwell family is so restrictive with copyright. I'm not even allowed to show this to you tonight. And so you don't see this image reproduced on coffee mugs or t-shirts or on posters or anything like that. It's really a historical artifact. Instead, what you see is this image, because this image is in the public domain. It was done by the government, by the Office of War Information, by J. Howard Miller, who was from Wilmerding. He's from Wilmerding. And he did this poster in February 1943 for, it was really one Westinghouse plant in East Pittsburgh, one plant. And it was meant not to encourage women in the workforce, it was meant to discourage absenteeism. That's all. It was, a slogan was put underneath it about absenteeism. You know, we can do it, we can break our record of the number of consecutive days we show up at work. And I think it was up for, at most, I would say 4 weeks. All of February 1943, maybe 2 weeks. And in the plant, in that Westinghouse plant where it was on a bulletin board, it was not big, it's like this big. You know, 14 by 18, something like that. The plant where it was displayed was a plant that made helmet liners. You guys know what helmet liners are? Yeah, it's what you wear under a helmet. It's a piece of plastic, a plastic helmet that you wear under your steel pot helmet. And Westinghouse made them. And my old friend Ed Reese, who passed away, he was the world's leading expert on Westinghouse. He said, and I love that he said this, that this isn't Rosie the Riveter. This is Helen, the helmet lining maker. That's really what she was meant to represent. And this thing was displayed for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. Then the rest of them that were printed up were never displayed. They were folded up, they were put in storage. And a graduate student, a young woman, graduate student in the 1980s, was doing research at the National Archives. She opened a box, opened a folder, unfolded the poster, and just loved it. And because it was in the public domain, it could be reproduced as much as you want, you know, without paying copyright. So I have a niece named Rosie. Rosie has shirts with this image on it. You know, she has a coffee mug with this image on it. This is an image that every American, no matter the age, I think recognizes. This woman, Geraldine Doyle, claimed for a while that she was the model for this poster. I hate to tell Geraldine, wonderful woman, she wasn't. And J. Howard Miller said, no, I didn't use them. You think I used a model for that? I didn't use a model for that. That's a pretty simple drawing, you know. Geraldine, she thought that this was her because of the headwear, the bandana on her head. Because when she worked at a plant in Michigan, working one of these machines in Michigan, she wore a bandana like that. And while she was working, a UPI photographer came and took her picture, and it was like her 15 minutes of fame, and then later in life, when the poster came out, she said, oh, that's me. And so she often would get referred to as the model for that poster, but she really wasn't. But the reason I'm bringing her up is I read her story, and a little detail in the story caught my attention and sobered me up. Geraldine worked this job for 2 weeks on that machine only, and she quit. And the reason she quit was she was a cello player. And she learned after 2 weeks that the woman who had previously worked on that machine had crushed her hand. She could not afford a crushed hand, so she quit the job. I like that detail because it just reminds you that these jobs were dangerous, many of them are. You can imagine, you know what it's like when you're working in a fast-paced environment. Mistakes are made, and when you're making, when you're pumping out heavy equipment and munitions and things like that at a rapid pace, people get hurt, and they did get hurt in World War II. Women, of course, also served in the military, and I do want to spend a few minutes talking about the 350,000 women who served in the armed forces in World War II. Again, we take it for granted that they did. But that was not the plan at the beginning. The only reason women served in the military was because we had a manpower shortage. And that's what it was called. And this was known. Every branch of service, we did not have enough men to fight 2 wars at the same time. We needed women to help. One woman who had seen these reports, and these reports were classified, was this woman, Edith Norris Rogers, who was a congresswoman from Massachusetts. She's an interesting person. She was one of the first female congresspeople in history. She took her husband's seat. I believe her husband died in 1925. She took his seat and then was reelected to it 16 times. She was a real champion of the armed forces. She was one of the authors of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, otherwise known as the GI Bill. She was a very powerful advocate of air power and of the Air Force especially. But when Pearl Harbor happened, she was on it. I mean, truly within 36 to 48 hours, she was already lobbying Congress to get women into the armed forces. And that was because she had served in World War I with the Red Cross. And she had remembered how horrible it was. If you want to read about unappreciated people, read about the American Red Cross women who went overseas to serve in France during World War I. They weren't given rations, they weren't given housing, they weren't given health care. If they died, and many of them do, because remember the Spanish flu, if they died, their parents had to, or their families had to ship the remains back home. They were given no protections if they were captured also. It was a hard existence. And nurses serving in the military were the same way. The Navy maybe had 700 nurses. The Army maybe had 1,000 nurses. Not many of them, and they weren't considered full members of the military. And so Edith Norris Rogers wanted to make sure that women were able to participate more fully in the military. She actually wanted them to participate almost entirely on equal terms. These guys were having none of that. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower here was quoted as saying in 1941, "Women will serve in the Army over my dead body." He later said it was the dumbest thing he ever said. But initially, yeah, there was great resistance to women serving in the Army. George Marshall on the right here was savvy enough to know that we needed women in the Army, and we have to work with this crazy woman, Rogers, so that she doesn't get everything she wants, but she can get some of what she wants. And so the final bill that they hammered out very quickly in early 1942 was H.R. 6293, which was an act to establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And the key word was auxiliary. There were two A's, WAAC. That was critical, that word. That meant they were helpers. They weren't full members of the Army. They were attached or helpers to the Army. And that was critical. They kept that in there. And so there were all kinds of restrictions on what the women, the highest ranking could be as a major. They couldn't command men. They wouldn't get the overseas pay. They wouldn't get rations. They wouldn't get uniforms. They wouldn't get death benefits. They wouldn't get the same military benefits after the war. And there were a lot of restrictions on, just to remind them that they weren't full members. And again, like I'll say, we take it for granted that they served, but the debate in Congress was absolutely ferocious. And the vote in the Senate was very close. This was very much a typical opinion of, there's a congressman named Andrew Summers said on the floor of the House, "A woman's army to defend the United States of America? Think of the humiliation. What has become of the manhood of America that we have to call on our women to do what has ever been the duty of men?" So probably the fiercest opponent of women serving in the Army and of this House Resolution 6293 was the Catholic Church. Millions upon millions of Americans went to church in early 1942, and their priests told them during the homilies, call your congressman, write your congressman, tell them to vote against this bill. We cannot have women serving in the Army. So it was a close vote, but it did pass. And the Army made a very good choice when they selected this woman, Oveta Kaltapabi, as the first commander of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Her job was to recruit the first 400 or so, 440 women, train them so that they could become the cadre to train the other 25,000 who were expected to join. Oveta Kaltapabi she was an attorney. She had, her husband had been governor of Texas, or maybe even was governor of Texas during this time. I'm not quite sure. Hobby Airport, right? In Houston, it was named after him. She had worked in the public relations in the War Department, so she understood how politics worked. She understood public relations. She was super smart, super charismatic, but still a woman, very much a woman, and that was important to the Army. And she said to the, I remember reading an interview with one of the 440 original WAACs who were recruited. She said she'll never forget when Hobby strode up and gave a General Patton-like lecture to the women. She said, the whole country is watching you. They're waiting for you to make a mistake. You cannot make any mistakes. You have to be perfect in everything you do because they are looking for an excuse to cancel this program. So those 440 women were extremely well trained, and they were turned out, and in turn, their job was to train the next 25,000 women. And that so many women applied to be a WAAC that they had to lift the lid to 150,000. So to accommodate the number of women who wanted to join. These women did all kinds of jobs. I remember, well, I don't remember, often somebody, if I give this talk or in class, will say, well, what did these women do in World War II? And my answer is they did everything but fire a gun. That's not much of an exaggeration. They did every other job. You know, the tip of the spear in war is what, 5%, 10% at most? Those who are actually serving on the front lines, firing their weapons at the enemy. 90%, 95% of the military are in support of that tip of the spear. The women filled every one of those positions, in the rear. They served in the Army Air Corps, which was the early Air Force at the time. They were, radio operators, radio repair people, air traffic operators. They worked in control towers. They were research and development. They did all kinds of jobs. And there's an interesting story in how the WAAC became the WAC, and I won't get into that, but it did change. Congress passed a bill, and it was major, in 1943 to remove the word auxiliary. And the reason was this: WACs were now being sent to North Africa. What if they were taken prisoner? Attorneys were saying they had no legal protections because they weren't full members of the military. So they had to be made not helpers, but WACs, and that's what became the Women's Army Corps. There's a whole interesting story about how that developed, because boy, there were a lot of fathers who didn't want their daughters to join the WACs. A lot of older brothers who didn't want their sisters joining the WACs. The Army had the WACs, the Navy had WAVs, women accepted for volunteer emergency service. And they were created by, you have to say this, they were the child of Edith Norris Rogers and this guy, Admiral Chester Nimitz, who got a call on December 8, 1941 from Congresswoman Rogers and said, I read a secret report about the Navy manpower problem. I know how you can solve it. And I think this is exactly what Nimitz looked like when he got that call. You can imagine. Because if you think the Army is traditional, the Navy is by far the most custom-bound of the armed services. They really didn't like the idea of women joining. But he, like General Marshall, was smart enough to know that he had to work with this crazy congresswoman, placate her, and together they developed this Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, WAVs. The idea is, again, they wouldn't be full members of the Navy. This would be a temporary condition that the women would be allowed to join on the condition of the national emergency, which was World War II, and then after the war they would be out of the military. And there were all kinds of restrictions. This woman was the head of it, Mildred McAfee. She was great. She had been the president of Wellesley College, and she was just as good as Hobby was with the WACs. WAVs couldn't leave the 48 states. They couldn't, I think, rise any higher than lieutenant commander, maybe commander, what did I write? Lieutenant commander. They couldn't command men. They were smaller, they were slightly more elite than the WAACs. They tended to do higher skilled jobs. And they made more money. I've interviewed, most of you know I interview a lot of veterans and have interviewed a lot of veterans over the years. And I've interviewed WAACs and WAAs. And to a person, truly, Julia, if you come tomorrow to our breakfast on Zoom at 9 a.m., ask Julia why she joined the WAVs and not the WAACs. Even Julia, who's brilliant, admitted the WAVs uniforms look better. You know, they got a $200 tailor stipend. $200 in 1943. There's a lot of money. So their uniforms, they do look better. They're tailored. You can tell. Here, WAACs on the right and WAVs on the left. Much sharper. Much sharper. Julia, what a person she is. She is absolutely a fascinating person. She grew up in Pittsburgh, went to Carnegie Tech, graduated, and joined the WAVs. They took her to Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, to give her a crash course in cryptography, how to decode encoded messages. Then they shipped her back down to Washington, D.C., where she worked in the Naval Communication Annex off DuPont Circle on this machine, the Enigma, which was the machine that generated the unbreakable German code. And her job was to break the code, crack the code. Her and, dozens and dozens of other mathematicians and, scientists were working on this code. Her division was called the Shark Division, and it was focused only on U-boats, German submarines in the North Atlantic. So they listened to the traffic coming from Berlin to the U-boats in the North Atlantic and back. She said that traffic, in other words, the messages that were passed 2 times a day, in morning and evening. Those were the 2 shots they had every day to get the message and then start trying to decode them. And she said every cliche you could imagine about this kind of work was true. That they did print them out. They did lay them on the ground. They did all stand there and stare at them and try to see patterns. It is said, and I asked her, it's said that the code Enigma was unbreakable. The Germans believed it could not be broken. And I asked her if she thought that was true, and she said, absolutely it's true. It really couldn't have been broken. She said the only way it could be broken is if we captured code books or if they made a mistake. And she said, happily, both happened. 3 sailors, the first code books I believe captured were 1943 in the Mediterranean. A German U-boat submarine was sinking. 3 British sailors jumped aboard, went down, got the code books, threw them out of the hatch, and 2 of those 3 sailors died, drowned on that U-boat. But they got the code books. And those code books were critical, she said, in helping us start to crack the larger code. The other mistake, and again, she can talk to you about it, it's so wonderful, she's so bright, so with it. She said it was the weather report. They gave the weather report in the Bay of Biscay the same way every day. So we learned the words for barometric pressure, temperature, wind velocity. It was a laziness. They made a mistake. You're never supposed to give anything the same way every day. But they got lazy and they did it, and that helped to break the code. So she said at many points during the war, we knew where every German U-boat was in the North Atlantic. And we had a big map on the wall with red pins in the map, each representing a German submarine. And the sad part was we sent our convoys into those submarines. And some of those submarines sank some of our ships, even though we knew the submarines were there. She said because if we went around them, the Germans would know we had the code, and they would change the code. So we had to sacrifice some ships. She said that was very, very hard. She said the other thing that was very hard, and she got emotional on March 2nd when she talked about it. I was surprised. I was still emotional. She said she at age 100, she still lives with the guilt of contributing to some of these German sailors' deaths. She said, we knew that because most of the messages being passed had nothing to do with the war. They were like, your wife says happy birthday. Your child just turned 3 back here in Berlin. She said, we knew the names of the crews, you know, we knew their ages, we knew about their families back home. We were listening in on their messages, and when they were killed, we cried. We imagined that they were just like we were. The other fascinating thing she can tell you about is about these things. I like to say they're called computers. And computers were invented. The modern computer that we use today was invented to decode Enigma. And this was the very first one. It was called the bomb. There were 180 of them built around the world, mostly in Britain and in the US. National Cash Register in, where was that, Toledo or Akron? Does anybody know? National Cash Register built them. Toledo. And Toledo built them. And shipped them to various top secret locations. One of them was the Naval Communication Annex in Washington, D.C. And Navy waves worked on them. Juliet did not. And she said she's glad she didn't because they were very, very hot. Like you could only work with them for 15 or 20 minutes at a time. And then you'd get in trouble. You'd get too hot. They had to relieve you. And they were very loud. Everybody who worked with them got serious hearing loss. They were also laughingly weak. I mean, this phone, I have an iPhone in my pocket. This phone is 2 billion times more powerful than that machine. 2 billion times more powerful. There were 180 of those machines built in World War II. If you harnessed all the computing power of all 180 machines that they expended during World War II, it could play 10 seconds of a YouTube video. So we've come a long way with these things. I'd like to add that there were also Coast Guards women. They were called SPARs, Semper Paratus, always ready. And their training was really along the lines of the Navy. And there were also Marines. And they did not have a name. They did not have a cute nickname. There were a few Marines in World War I. They were called Marinettes. And the commandant of the Marines in World War II, this guy at the beginning of the war, Thomas Holcomb, steadfastly refused to give the female Marines a nickname. And he explained it this way. They are Marines. They don't have a nickname and they don't need one. They get their basic training in Marine atmosphere and a Marine post. They inherit the traditions of Marines. They are Marines. And maybe I'll end just there with that, I think, quite noble statement. Thank you. Please, questions, comments, rebuttals. I mean, who here really thinks we're better? Yes. You do. Yes, Joe.
Back to the early part of your presentation, school teachers. In the 40s, Bridgeville Grade School had all women teachers. I think they were all single. I can name 8 of them probably, if I took the time to do it. And without exception, every one of them gave up their childbearing years and married when they were, and I don't know whether they were still teaching school then, maybe the policy changed, but they're all women, they're all single.
And they were all single.
Great
Yeah.
teachers too, by the way.
I heard, somebody told me that they remember a teacher of theirs, she grew up in Pittsburgh, a teacher of hers, go across the state lines in Ohio and get married there because the marriage couldn't get tracked as easily by the school district, and she kept her job. Yeah.
What was the policy of our opponents in the war, especially the Germans? in relation to using women in their
Oh,
work?
yeah, oh, that's a great point. The question is, how did the other belligerent powers in World War II, did they involve women in the war effort? The answer is yes, in a big, big way. More than the Americans did. The British a whole lot more. The Germans more. Even though the Germans, the Nazi ideology was very conservative, conservative patriarchy, very anti-feminist, they had no choice. They had to employ, they had women didn't fly combat operations until maybe very late in the war, but they were varying pilots like our WASPs, a whole lot of them. And
Weren't there a lot that served in the Luftwaffe? I think there was some favorite, Hitler had some favorite women who were pilots, who were test pilots. And
yes, you're absolutely correct. They were test pilots, and they were ferrying pilots. In other words, a plane would be broken down, or a plane would just have to be delivered somewhere. Women would often do that job, to fly the plane, so that to free up men for combat. I believe very late in the war, some of those women served in combat. Some of you might know that history better than I do. The Russians, of course, used women in combat. Russians were in the infantry, as well as in the Air Force.
My husband was in Europe in World War II, and if I remember correctly, he escorted General Eisenhower, and his driver was a female in a uniform. Was she not a member of the service?
Yeah, no, you're talking about your husband saw Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who was often with a woman, right?
Drove his car.
Who was his aide, drove the car. Her name was what? Kay Hutchinson? No. Kay, what was her name?
it was Summers.
Kay Summers. That's it, it was Kay Summers. Good, thank you. Kay Summers, yes, they had a very close relationship. They were romantically involved. What are you laughing?
It's true.
Yeah, they were.
I believe it.
Yeah,
I believe it.
yeah, so they had a close
And
relationship.
she was in the service?
Yeah, she was in the military. Yeah, she was a WAAC.
You had said earlier he didn't approve of women in the service.
I think she helped change his mind.
I have a question, Professor. The women who worked in the canteens to serve coffee and donuts, were they part of the military structure, or were they volunteers? Or?
They were not, they were volunteers. On the home front, they were, anybody could do it. The Bridgeville Historical Society could send volunteers down to the local canteen, down in Pittsburgh, at the USO canteen, and, serve the men who were coming through donuts and coffee and things like that. Overseas, that was the job of the Red Cross. And Red Cross women were sometimes called donut dollies, or club mobile women. They would serve coffee and donuts, and they got a bad reputation in World War II. And I mean a bad reputation. I just remember with the Veterans Breakfast Club when we started, a lot of men had horrible memories, hated the Red Cross, would never donate to the Red Cross. Yeah, you know that. Hated the Red Cross. And there were a couple reasons for that. Number one, at first when the Red Cross went overseas, they started handing out coffee and donuts to American troops for free. But the British protested and said, our Red Cross is charging the soldiers. You're making us look bad. You got to charge them. So the Red Cross started charging enlisted men, but giving officers donuts for free. Man, what a way to piss off enlisted men, huh? And Red Cross women had a reputation for consorting with officers who would give them, benefits that enlisted men weren't getting. So that is, they had to overcome that reputation. There's quite a bit. They've done quite a bit of work over the past 75 years. In fact, we had a program on our Veterans Breakfast Club with donut dollies. It was wonderful. We had 2 of them in January. Donut dollies, mainly, we had one World War II, one Korea, and then mainly Vietnam donut dollies, Red Cross volunteers. And they said, like, every once in a while, they'll still get cussed out by a World War II vet for, for how they were treated by the Red Cross. We're still living that down, they say. But yeah, and you know, one detail that I didn't reveal, and I should have, is that when I said at the beginning of the talk that the demand, the estimate was that we were going to need 25 million women, you know, serving in the workforce. Do you know we never reached that goal? Only 18 million joined the workforce. A lot of married women would not work. We definitely praise Rosie the Riveter, but we forget that a large number of women who just couldn't do it, just wouldn't do it. All right, thank you.